without any further ado, I'd like to begin this grand final on the motion this House believes that former colonial powers should not be involved in peacekeeping and nation-building missions in their former colonies. So without any further ado, welcome the Prime Minister. We're here.
Honorable panel, when generations of people have been literally screwed over by foreign powers trying to take over their land, trying to exploit their resources, trying to enslave their people, we think it is extremely paternalistic and very insulting for these colonial powers that have once tried to harm them, come back and turn around and say that we want to help you guys build your own countries in the way that we see fit, and we think that this is incredibly paternalistic and that you're imposing that Western values and Western ideas on nations that have their own unique identity, and we think this is going to lead to a lot of harms. Okay, first off, I'm going to do my model before I get into 2 points of constructive. First of all, why we think all independent states, even former colonial powers, have their own interests and how that harms nation building and stuff like that. And secondly, we think that colonial powers lack the understanding of cultural and religious divides and nuances within that within their former colonies in order to form good political structures for them. Okay, but first a model. So we would define this House believes as we generally think that this is a bad idea. We generally think that former colonies should not act this way, and we oppose this on a principle basis. And we think that former colonial powers or any foreign nation that once invaded another country in order to get resources, in order to expand their land and expand their power, etc. We would define peacekeeping and nation building as an active role in building political institutions and building a country. Okay, so first point about why we think independent states actually hurt this in nation building. So we think that all former colonial powers have certain interests at heart. At the end of the day, they still care about their own they still care about their own nation, and they're going to put that first and foremost. We think that whenever another actor is putting their own interests above the interest of building a good nation, we think that this is going to harm them in some way. So we give you the example of the Central African franc, which is a group of countries in Central Africa that have the same currency as France. So what France was trying to do was when their former colonies became independent, they tried to create their a system of trade and that used the same currency, and we think even today they still use the same currency. But the problem with this is these countries are currently being tied back from a lot of economic progress. We think that France still keeps them because this gives them some sort of influence and sway within Central Africa. So we think countries like French West Africa and Ivory Coast, they're right now currently, France is benefiting off of this, and that this is holding them back from other economic stuff. And this also leads to over-dependence on Europe and over-dependence on the over-dependence on aid from their former colonial powers that used to hold them in power. So we don't think that's necessarily good. Okay. Secondly, we think that colonial powers lack a lot of understanding of cultural and religious divides. So we think that, first of all, colonial powers never truly understood the cultural and religious differences within the people that they were trying to take over. Colonial takeover was inherently oppressive, and we don't think that they necessarily understand or respect the cultures there. So, for example, Israel and Palestine, we think that when they were trying to create a separate state for Israeli people and Muslim people, they basically drew a jigsaw map down the area of what is now known as Israel, and we think that this terrible jigsaw map never really worked out for them. This is why they're still having conflict decades and decades later after this was first proposed. So we think that because they didn't understand a lot of the differences between these two cultures, and because they didn't understand geographic proximity and stuff, there was a huge conflict. Also, we think that there's and we have other examples such as India and Pakistan, where India was created as a nation for Hindu people, and Pakistan was created as a place for Muslim people. When people of different, these two different religions tried to cross over to their respective nation, there was literally massive deaths and massive slaughters between the two religions. So we think that a lot of although these former colonial powers were trying to help, they didn't understand the situation enough in order to do so. In order to help in a meaningful way. Why do we think that countries themselves and these colonies have a better understanding? We think that these new political structures of these former colonies are going to be made up of the people who understand the language, who understand the culture, and who understand the nuances within that group of people. We think they're going to be able to better help and create a better way, a form of government, and create better institutions. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Panel. There are two main actors within this round. Firstly, the former colonial powers, and second of all, the countries that were previously colonialized. If I can prove to you that we bring benefits, and the most benefits towards both of these actors, then we clearly win this round of debate. Firstly, I'm going to prove to you constructive about how we give former colonial powers a chance to create a better image within the international community and in the world in general, and how this is a form of reparation. And I'll be moving on to my second argument about how previously colonialized countries benefit from this, and then finally I'll end off with some refutation. Firstly, in terms of the former colonial powers, I want to make it really clear that these powers have previously exploited these other countries, right? We completely agree with this fact. This is exactly why it is only justified for them to make up for their previous mistakes. We think that it is especially crucial for these countries with the most precedent to actually help these countries in turn that they are previously harmed, right? For instance, America may not have harmed Africa in the past. This is why we don't think that necessarily that they should be the primary actor that now helps them when they have violence. Instead, we think that other countries that have previously harmed them, they have the most responsibility to try to help them when now they have more, when now they're going through harm. We think that these countries have the most precedent to help them in turn. I think that peacekeeping and nation building takes up a lot of a country's resources. If a country is willing to spend so much of their own personal resources on another country and instead of their own country, this really says something about how they're really trying to help the other country for good intentions instead of harming them. I mean, it is especially crucial to give these countries a new chance and an opportunity to form a good image, because we want to let countries know that yes, if you may have committed a crime or like a war crime in the past or a mistake in the past, it's completely fine if now you're going to make up for that. And also what we have to note here is that it is a moral obligation for these countries to help the other countries that they have harmed in the past. Yes, we know that they have committed terrible crimes and terrible atrocities in these countries in the past, but it's only because of this we see that now it is their turn. Now we should give them a chance to fix that mistake. We don't think that we should condemn them when they're trying to help. We don't want these countries to be running away from these past mistakes. We want them to confront them and directly help these countries and say that we're sorry, but now we want to help you develop your own country. Moving on to my second point about how this helps previously colonialized countries and how these countries benefit. The only result of bad relations is harm towards both sides, both the developed countries and the less developed countries, for a few reasons. Firstly, we have to note that these countries are extremely hateful towards each other because since a child you learn that maybe Britain tortured people within my country. Now I'm going to hate them forever. And these people within these less developed countries are very likely to be educated in a certain way, to be biased, a harmful bias against these stronger countries that may actually be beneficial to their countries. A few problems here. Firstly, this ends up with a really terrible relationship with trade, right? And we have to remember that former colonial powers are often the countries that are the biggest player within the world economy, such as the United Kingdom or France, right? Because of this, the people within the countries that were previously colonialized have a lower quality of life because now they're less likely to work with these larger countries that were former colonial powers simply because there's a harmful or negative stigma towards them. We think that now this is a new time, right? Now these less developed countries should take the initiative to work with these other developed countries in order to improve the state of their country. We don't think that they should be dwelling on the past. There is a practical benefit. We think that these countries should be able to take the benefit of that. But secondly, many peacekeeping and nation-building resources actually come from these former colonial powers, right? Like for instance, the UK and France, they have lots of peacekeeping resources because they're such big countries, they're such rich countries. Because of this, if now we have less developed countries not willing to work with them, or local government unwilling to negotiate with them, this means that there's less aid in the areas of violence where they crucially need them. What this means is that now there's going to be less resources for the violence and the people who are actually dying within these countries. Yes, there may have been mistakes in the past, but now we think that if there's actually war and violence going on in a certain area, we think that government should let go of this and actually work with the other countries that can go and save the citizens within their country, right? We think this is the most important part of this round. We think that yes, there may have been mistakes, but there's a practical benefit in your country if you can save lives. That is exactly what you should focus on. Let's move on to some refutation to what we've heard from side proposition. The first thing that we heard was that colonialization colonization was really oppressive and hostile, and because many lives were lost, like, people are going to be hateful. Okay, I would like to note here that it is now a different generation. Yes, our previous governments may have been extremely mean towards other countries, but now we have a new set of government. We have a bunch of new people that are willing to enact different actions, right? They're not going to commit the same crimes as before because they're different people. The people who have committed the crimes are already dead. Now we have other people that are going to make up for their mistakes. We don't think that they necessarily should be held accountable for something that this new government hasn't even done. I think that, yes, there is precedent for them to help, but they shouldn't be condemned for trying to help them. Next, I tell you how local governments know better because, like, the other countries don't know, like, the cultural differences. We're not saying that it should be, like, the former colonial powers that make this new country or, like, help them build the whole entire country. It is simply just providing aid and helping them. We think that, yes, the local government should have the main say, but we think that these stronger countries should also direct resources to them to help them. Thanks.
All right, am I good to start? Honorable panel, we see this motion as incredibly paternalistic and condescending towards former colonies that these nations exploited for their resources, for their manpower. We're very proud to oppose this bill today on that moral ground. Panel, what will I be doing for you? Firstly, I'm going to be presenting a constructive point titled White Savior Complex, and then followed up by refutation on the points brought up by the previous speaker. I will then conclude the case for the opening government. So, getting right into it, our constructive point. Honorable panel, we believe that it is incredibly detrimental for a paternalistic, condescending relation like this to kind of be rekindled, right, between former oppressors and a country that has been oppressed by these Europeans, right? What is a white savior complex, right? It's the idea that we need Europeans, and more specifically white people, to help these countries in places such as Africa, right? And that furthermore, these Europeans and whites are the only people who can do that, right? They're the only people who can do this nation building for us, and we need them in our country, right? We need these people to help us. What happens as a result? Let's bring up a bit of a mechanism. Firstly, the Europeans are now able to justify over-involvement and interfering, right? Under the idea that we're the only ones who can do it because these people themselves can't. And even if they do mess up a little bit in the process, they can use the reason that, you know what, our intentions are good, right? We want to help this nation get built up. We want to apologize for our mistakes. And really, we're the only ones who can do it because this country is in a mess, right? Now, looking at our other actor, what happens down there in the former colonies, in, say, African countries, right? These people start to believe that they are powerless, or they lack institutions and are unable to help themselves. And often politicians in these countries might sell these ideas for their own benefit. However, we tell you that this isn't the truth. There have been many examples of where countries have been able to get themselves organized and try and overcome the harms done by colonial oppressors. For example, in Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide was caused when the colonial power in Rwanda divided the country based on basically an invented ethnic division, right? They divided two people who used to live together in relative harmony and caused them to go to war against each other, basically tearing the country apart. What happened afterwards this genocide was that Rwandans were able to get their country back together, and today cities in Rwanda are relatively safe compared to the rest of Africa and are starting to develop with a stronger economy and better living conditions for the citizens. We tell you that if we're able to eliminate this relation that exists between countries in Europe and countries in Africa that see that they need this help from their former colonial oppressors, we're going to be seeing, firstly, a stronger national identity and more national pride in these countries, which could result in more like a greater effort by the people of this country and a greater belief by the people of this country that their country can do something great and become like much more developed than it is today, right? We think that this could motivate the citizens and the politicians and the systems in this country to become more organized and to become better designed, right? Secondly, we tell you that when European countries do not interfere in nation building, which could be, say, designing institutions, right, helping out governments, overseeing certain parts of the country, we get more intelligent governance designed by the people down on the ground in those countries, right? It's much better when people are able to decide what kind of governance works for themselves and represents their people best, right? We do not need a former colonial oppressor who put in systems of governance that clearly did not work to go back in and botch things up and tell them what they need to do from wherever they are in Europe, right? Finally, we tell you that these people are going to have more confidence in their ability to fix and deal with their issues. They're going to be more optimistic about the outlook of their nation, and we tell you they can go quite far because people are going to want to stay in their nation, they're going to want to help it grow, and ultimately at the end of the day, they're going to have more belief in themselves as a people, not in Europeans coming in to help them. At this point, I'll take a POI from the opposition bench. Go ahead.
Above all, isn't it the most important to fulfill our moral obligation to try to direct all the resources or the most resources we can to protecting the people within areas of violence in, for instance, Africa?
I'm going to refute that in my refutation, right? She tells us that we're less likely to work together and that we have, an obligation. Nation building should be done by oppressors to make up for this. We tell you that, sure, even if on moral grounds you are correct, we'll take that. We'll take their case at its best. We tell you on practical grounds, this doesn't always end up working the way it should. Nation building is incredibly complex. It's difficult to create good institutions that ensure governance and stability for a particular country. Countries have different political systems because every single country is different, comprises of different people, has different political issues, and we need to address that in the best way that we can. And the best way that we can is by actually asking the people down there on the ground what they want their country to look like. So we tell you, even if they have good intentions on side opposition, they haven't really told us why European and Western influence is needed in those countries, and it is on that basis we're so proud to reject their case. Thank you.
Here, here.
Honorable panel, on side opening opposition today, we recognize that these former colonial powers have greatly exploited people in their former colonies in the past, right? We think that, however, on our side, that allowing them to take part in these missions, peacekeeping missions and nation-building missions, act as a form of reparation to these countries for the atrocities that they've committed in the past, right? We don't think that it completely solves what they did in the past and completely balances out what they did, but we think that is a step in the right direction and something that government does not offer, right? A couple things in this speech. Firstly, I'll be going into my refutation of everything you've heard outside opening government, and then I'll be going to my rebuilding of my partner's 1 point, because we heard very little refutation from the deputy leader of the Deputy Prime Minister, right? Okay, let's start with the first point of refutation, right? They tell you that, so Grace tells you about how former colonial powers have their own interests, right? And that they'll essentially wipe out the cultures of the countries that they're going to, the former colonies that they're trying to nation build in, right? Okay, couple of responses to this, right? First of all, we tell you that we don't think that nation building necessarily eliminates 100% westernizes a country, right? We don't think that it necessarily eliminates all of their culture, because this is still one people, and it's not like we're recolonizing them, right? We're not going in and essentially wiping all their institutions and starting from scratch. We're merely helping them bolster their existing institutions. So we don't think that this 100% westernization actually occurs, right? But second of all, we tell you that the quality of the quality of life in these former colonies currently is comparatively very low on the global scene, right? So we tell you that this slight loss of culture on our side of the house is a harm that we have to bite in order to for example lower things like infant mortality in these developing countries, right, through a healthcare system that is bolstered by nation building by former colonial power. We think that this is a necessary harm that we have to bite, a little loss of culture to save potentially thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives in these developing countries, right? Okay, second point of refutation on how these regions are culturally and religiously distinct, and the colonial powers don't actually understand this well enough to be able to nation build in there, right? Okay, we tell you that, well, we concede that that these former colonial powers aren't the most familiar with local culture and local religion, right? We tell you that we truly need their presence if we want to save lives and better the quality of life in these former colonies, right? And I'll be getting more into that into my third refutation, which is on their point about this paternalistic relationship, what Eric titled white savior complex. Yeah. Right? He tells you that interference in these countries is merely framed under the guise of helping them, and that these countries can actually help themselves and build their nation themselves. They don't need European intervention, right? A couple things here. First of all, we tell you that we don't think that Europeans are absolutely necessary to nation building these countries, right? We tell you that first of all, as previously mentioned, we think Europeans are taking the first step in providing reparations for what they did in the past. But we also tell you that like while these countries are probably able to eventually going to like build up their country by themselves, we think that European intervention will speed up development, right? Why do we think that the speed of development in this case matters substantially, right? We think that time is not on our side in these cases because people in these countries are dying and suffering, by the minute, and we think that we need to encourage development in these countries ASAP, right? We need to develop their educational systems, their healthcare systems, in order to lower the amount of suffering and deaths we see in these countries. We think that time is on our side. We think that European intervention or not intervention, but European nation building and peacekeeping will help speed up the timeline essentially in these countries, right? On to rebuilding. Essentially what he tells us is that, essentially what Eric tells us about my partner's point about the duty of the former colonial power to compensate for what they did in the past, right? He concedes our principal point and says that instead, on the practical grounds, essentially what he says is that, oh guys, nation building is hard, so we shouldn't do it, right? I don't think that that's too much a valid point. No, thank you. Right? We're telling you that on our side of the house, at least we make an effort to help these countries. Right? First of all, we have these countries who are essentially indebted to these countries who we want them to be able to help these countries in a way to act as reparations, and we think that they can do this through peacekeeping and nation building. But on our side of the house, at least we make it seem like these nations actually want to help them. Right? If they just want to on their side of the house, what they want is for them to stand idly by because they've already committed atrocities that are in the past. We think that it is much more beneficial for the relationships between these countries if they actually go in there and help going on the ground and help these countries build up their healthcare systems, build their educational system. That's why we're so incredibly proud to oppose.
Whenever I'm ready. When you hurt someone and leave them in a situation of destitute, do you go back and bug them and say, hey, do you forgive me, until they forgive you? No, you leave them. You leave them to heal, and you leave them to figure themselves out and get better, and then you approach, which is why we so proudly propose. Today, I'm going to be doing two things for you today. I'm going to be firstly giving my extension about the effectiveness of these missions and how this fuels hatred for previous colonial powers, and secondly, I'm going to be going into refutation of side opening opposition. Onto my extension. So, I want to talk about the effectiveness of these missions, and this is something that Opening Gov touches on, but doesn't really expand on fully. So, first subpoint, I want to talk about cooperation. So there's a pre-existing hatred in a lot of these, in a lot of past colonized countries towards colonial powers, because they came in, they messed up the society, they made them dependent on colonial powers, and then they left them in a position in which they couldn't care for themselves, in which they left them in which they couldn't sustain themselves. We think that this creates a lot of justified hatred towards colonial powers of the population. Now the problem is that you have a people and you have government not willing to allow powers or to accept these colonial powers to re-enter back into their countries. Now the reason why this is important is because peacekeeping missions and nation building missions require an immense amount of cooperation. Eric already talked to you about why nation building, why nation building requires cooperation, in the sense that you need to be aware of the culture and society, you need to be aware of the governments. But I want to talk specifically also about peacekeeping, which is that it's not the same as peacemaking, in which you can send individual units into a country. You need to be, you're sending people and you're sending soldiers in to defend a population, to defend people from attack. In order to do that, you need to have these people be willing to cooperate with soldiers, be able to listen to soldiers, and be able to move themselves in a fashion in which that's effective and able to keep them safe. To the point at which you have a population that, if I'm in a country and there's a soldier telling me, hey, you need to get to this place to stay safe, I'm going to protect you, I'm not willing to listen, because this is the same person, this is the person from the same country that came in about 50 years ago and completely messed up my country, completely messed up my population, is the reason why my family lives in poverty, is the reason why I can't make enough money to survive on a daily basis. At the end of the day, we don't think these peacekeeping missions, we don't think these nation-building missions are actually going to be effective to the extent that they can help these countries significantly. And what this does is leads me to my second subpoint, which is the impact on the people within this country. Now we think that because of this whole idea of cooperation and why that's so necessary and you don't actually get that, means that a lot of these missions are likely to fail or be less effective, not to the extent that would actually matter. So what that happens is when you have, failed peacekeeping missions, and I'm a person and say, you know what, you're a colonial power, and you came back in, you said you came under the guise of peacekeeping missions, and then you failed and you let my people die. This furthers and fuels the pre-existing hatred towards colonial powers that already exist in that country. What this leads to is this means that you have a certain anger among citizens towards colonial powers who say, you come in, you colonialize, and you walk away, and then you walk back in, and we think that it's really bad for these. Oh no, I don't know where I'm going with this. Hold up. Okay, yeah. We think that there's a certain anger among the population when they see people from past colonial powers walk into the country, walk amongst them like nothing's wrong and they haven't done anything, and act like they're trying to help them. We think that this pushes post-colonial countries further away. It pushes them away from cooperating with bigger powers. It pushes them away from getting involved in the global community, and overall hurts relations and hurts the potential for long-term development in this sense. The last thing I want to talk about is why other actors, I'll take you in a second, why other actors are so much better to do this job, but you seem to disagree.
In times of violence, wouldn't you agree that most people will want to have their lives protected than
I'll get to that. Okay, so why are other actors actually better fitted to this role? So firstly, we think that there's no hatred, so you don't have this problem of cooperation. But secondly, we think that it's better when you have other local countries pitching in, for peacekeeping missions and nation-building missions, because it helps establish connections within the local sphere with countries in close proximity, as opposed to growing dependent on foreign, large post-colonial powers. We think that these not only are countries in the area more aware of the culture, but they're also aware of the political sphere of the region. They know certain actors, people like terrorists, people like different government parties that post-colonial powers may not recognize or be aware of. Lastly, into refutation. So they bring up three main points. One about reparations. Okay, firstly, we think that this is just cruel in the sense that as a post-colonial power, you completely reject this nation's desire for autonomy and the desire to be left alone. For global economy, they say, it's important for them to get involved in the global economy. We think it's better to first establish a local economy before you move up. In the global economy, currently, they're just producing with resources. And lastly, they talk about how it's important to have aid from these bigger countries. We think that these countries can still provide and fund smaller peacekeeping nations from local countries. They don't have to actually put their people in. Thank you.
Honorable panel, what does it mean to take forgiveness, right? Under what circumstances will we be helping a certain area out that increases the relationship between both the countries on both sides? So today on opposition, we certainly believe that there is room for more achievement and growth between the relationship between colonies and a country. So what will I be doing for you today? I will be adding my extension about how helping these countries will create a better relationship for them in the long-term future, right? And my partner will be doing most of the refutation on this half, okay? So moving on to my extension on how this will help create better relationships between the countries, right? So we're going to provide more specific examples on why this is important and how this will actually help that we have seen through history so far, which is why we're different from opening opposition, okay? So culture still has a lasting impact in the former colonies that we see, right? And countries should be able to help other colonies that have a cultural connection with each other, right? This is important to help promote the idea that they're still connected in some ways culturally, right? And this is really important because it provides a connection despite the hatred that they have caused throughout, right? When colonies were settling the land, there was most likely dispute at the time, right? For example, 50 years later, settlers who are still being held accountable for actions of the original settlers committed years ago, right? And this is really, really tragic. So we want to help build up the country again, to build up a better mindset about what the colonies are and what the countries mean to the colony, right? So in the past, colonies were also forced to fight against countries that the main country had problems with, right? And this created a bad relationship between these colonies and the original country, right? Because the country comes and they leave the country in shambles, right? So they don't really have anything constructive for the country, right? Say, for example, a country colonizes a country for the oil and then leaves the country completely in disasters, right? It should be the country's obligation and responsibility to help this country out and protect them because they were once a part of this area. They were once responsible for the resources in this area, and they do have an obligation to really protect this land that they abused with their colonies, right? Also noting that colonies are a lot weaker than the other countries, and they're more subject to being targeted by more powerful countries, right? For example, England is strong, and many countries would not want to invade England, but they would be certainly more willing to invade England's colony, right? And if another country wants land, they're most likely going to go for colonies, right? So therefore, the risk and danger towards colonies is more present in terms of territories, right? And as a result, countries who own these colonies should really look towards the protection for these colonies to make sure that there's safety, right? No, thank you. So it's also the country's responsibility to help protect these areas that they have devastated once, right? Helping the colonies build up their nation is a way to show redemption through the colonies, right? We want to change the relationship so that the relationship between the colonies and the countries is a lot better, and that there certainly is room for this, and it's not as detrimental as we have heard from side government, right? So it shows forgiveness, despite what they have done 100 years ago. When you see that the country's actually there and actually trying to help you guys build up the colony again, because they actually care about their state and what is going on, right? So countries where the colonies originate from are the only countries who will actually have incentive to help out these colonies, right? Other random countries aren't going to want to help out the colonies. You seem to disagree.
Why is forgiveness appropriate when the people from these countries aren't willing to forgive you?
Okay. I'll be getting onto that in my examples in a second, okay? So actually on that note, so let's take a look at 3 examples I have that have worked in the past, where we have helped rebuild areas, and this has fostered relationships that are positive, okay? So firstly, in World War I, right, Canada sacrificed a lot for Britain and was ordered around a lot by Britain, right? Canada lost lots of men. However, Britain now has an obligation to Canada, right? They can sacrifice themselves for Canada too, and they certainly are willing to with the strong relationship that we have between Canada and Britain. Second example, right, the First Nations. We've done caused so much damage towards the First Nations, right? And today we have reprimanded them for all the things that we have done, right? And now there's a lot stronger bond between the First Nations people and the Canadian government, right? And finally, after harming Germany in World War I, we put them down with the Treaty of Versailles, right? And as a result, this created so much tension, and it actually created another war. But if we look at what we did at the end of World War II, right, we went in there and we helped rebuild their country. And as a result, right, the relationship between Germany and these people is so much stronger, right? Germany has such a strong economy, and and as a result, there's better relationship between Germany and, say, the Allied forces, right? So looking at these examples, it is totally possible for us to create stronger relationships between these countries and these colonies and truly change them for the good, right? So we need to help rebuild these economies, rebuild these colonies, help build their economy, and help show them that we truly care and that the relationship between us and the colonies matters. Thank you.
Honorable Speaker, recognize that for these peacekeeping and nation-building missions to actually work, we need cooperation from the people, right? We need people to actually cooperate with these nations in order for maximum effectiveness. My partner tells you exactly why this doesn't happen, exactly why that leads to the failure of missions, and why exactly this furthers the hate of colonial powers. It's better if they just don't interfere. On that basis, we're very proud to propose. So, I'll be giving you 2 themes today. Firstly, of which side actually obtains better peacekeeping and nation building, and secondly, about the principle of justification of both sides of this debate. So firstly, what we get from opening opposition is that, on the first theme, is that we should allow colonial powers to interfere because they're able to save lives, because they're able to do peacekeeping, right? Okay, a couple of responses to this. My partner already told you why exactly this doesn't work, right? Because my partner tells you how there's no cooperation from the people or the government. My partner tells you how, like, nation building and peacekeeping requires cooperation, and colonial powers just don't work because literally years ago they came into your country and ruined a lot of things for you. We think that the government's probably not going to want to cooperate, and neither are the people. Plus, in addition to this, we think that former colonies a lot of the time already years ago requested for their own autonomy, their ability to control themselves, to govern themselves, right? We don't think that they're very open for help from these colonial powers once again. So in this case, we think that they're not going to be very cooperative. We think that these missions are likely going to fail. What's the impact of this? My partner tells you how this furthers the hate of colonial powers, and there's going to be failure of saving lives. So this completely clashes with their point on how we're not actually able to save the most amount of lives, as if, let's say, a third party from, let's say, a more local place that better understands this nation in the future is better able to connect with this nation in the future and have better relations that way, is going to be way more effective in peacekeeping and nation building in this sense. So let's give you a world comparison, right? Okay, first I'll take a POI.
If your life is literally in danger, would you prioritize holding a grudge against a certain nation, which the generation is already dead and it's a new generation, or would you prioritize saving your life and actually cooperating with those peacekeepers?
I think okay, a lot of the time when you have hate towards people, right, we think that on an individual basis, there's likely for people to just not cooperate with soldiers, right? But even despite this, we think that like if the government wants to be autonomous and wants to govern themselves, and colonial powers forcefully come in and try to peacekeep or like try to like help them build up their nation, we think this is just detrimental because the government's not going to cooperate, and we think there's going to be more things like violence and more things like the government telling them to leave, and we think that in general it's just not going to be as effective if we just let a third-party nation that's not a colonial power to help them, right? We think that we're able to get the same benefits that they say they claim they get on their side of the house, but at the same time we aren't getting the effects, the detrimental effects James already tells you in his speech. Okay, second theme of principal justification, right? Okay, what opposition tells us is that colonial powers can improve their image for formal colonies, and they're morally obligated to do so to fix up their mistakes, right? And closing gives us a similar case that's kind of odd, and they tell us how there's the principal obligation of protecting their colonies. Okay, so a few responses to this. Firstly, I think that both of these points fall if we can simply prove to you why we aren't able to effectively help them, right? Okay, I think my partner's case on how exactly we don't get the cooperation from them, we aren't able to save the amount of people, we aren't able to be effective, already counters this. But furthermore, my partner tells you about exactly why these countries have already in the past conveyed their desire for autonomy. And by simply going into these countries and trying to like peacekeep or let's say build their nation, you're violating their desire for autonomy, and we think that on a principle basis this is also bad, right? We think that we shouldn't be like allowing colonial powers to go into their former colonies and simply doing this. We think that on a principle basis this is also detrimental. Furthermore, I'll tell you why exactly we're so different from our opening, right? Our opening focuses on why exactly colonial powers are bad actors, right? My partner tells you why exactly we don't get cooperation. We literally have lives at stake because of the fact that governments and people aren't willing to cooperate, right? And my partner also gives you more impacts of how exactly the failure of missions furthers the hate of towards these colonial powers in the future. And finally, my partner tells you exactly why third parties going in and doing this peacekeeping and nation building is more effective because of the fact that in the future you're able to get more reliable like allies and helpers instead of like relying on the colonial power, which is what they want you to do because of what our opening already told you about their intentions, right? And finally, we tell you that like local nations are better able to like understand these nations in a way that allows them to go in and let's say mitigate the detriments that opening tells you about the lack of understanding of religion and cultural divides. So for all of these reasons, because only on closing opposition do we give you sufficient enough analysis and tell you the impact of what exactly happens when these missions aren't effective, and because we won on principle justification, we're so proud to propose.
Thank you, honorable panel. On side closing opposition, we believe that colonial powers are not only incentivized to help their former colonies, but their help will also result in benefits for both sides and result in a better world altogether. So first, I will be presenting my two themes, which are will foreign help result in a better world, and why should colonial powers specifically help? So firstly, on the side of opposition, we believe that foreign help will result in a better world. This is shown by the many examples that my partner has presented to you, such as how Germany after World War I was treated really badly, and thus there was the World War II. However, after World War II, we gave them lots and lots of aid, and now they have this booming economy and we have good relations between them. We see that this works and that this should be the precedent for how we are going to treat foreign relations in the future. In addition, let's say that this help is absolutely needed. Let's say that a country is left in complete disarray after colonialism. They have bad foreign relations due to the actions taken in the past, and they have little resources. We see that these countries are unable to help themselves, and that they may need help to get back on their feet. And that this also incentivizes other countries to help them as well, maybe even through softer means, such as financial aid, rather than all crowding into that one country. We see that they are more incentivized to provide financial aid due to having to provide less. We see that the government presents to use this case that the colonial powers will go in there and recolonize those countries, and that they will say, this is how everything must be done. However, we see that they can build up systems by providing like manpower and funds to build like schools, to build hospitals, and they then provide like money and staff to run them. And then we see that they can let them I'll get to you later, sorry. I'll let you, then we see that they can let the countries adapt them as they see fit, such as changing the schooling system if they want to have a religion class. We see that, that just by helping them, you are not forcing them into anything. And then back op says that it will not, back gov says that this help will not work due to a lack of cooperation, as there is bad relations between the countries. However, what do you think, I'll get to you later, what do you think causes worse relations? Helping the countries immediately when they have problems, or just idly sitting by, letting them get into worse and worse trouble? Let's say that a country is in, I'll get to you later, is in disarray after, let's say that a country is in complete disarray after being colonized, and that they suddenly need this help against a foreign power that's invading them. How would they feel if they were like, this colonial power did something really bad to me? Why aren't they helping me now? Like, they have so much power and they're not helping me. And then they allow this bad relation to brew and become stronger rather than just accepting the help from the colonial power right away. And you seem to disagree?
You talk about friendship. Friendship only happens if your efforts work. Opening government has given you many reasons why former colonial powers are poor actors for peacekeeping and nation building. Why do you think these distant Europeans can do better?
So we see that the mistakes made in the past are due to selfish leaders who want to only solve one point. However, we see that people were misinformed then because they had less access to information and less access to foreign affairs. But now with the advent of like news through social media and such, if a leader says they'll do something and they think that's harmful, they see all these countries being harmed due to it, they'll know that it is wrong and thus oppose it. In addition, BACGov brings up a third party that can help them. But why would this third party want to help them? We see that neighboring countries may also be poor. They may not have enough resources to help them, since poor countries are often clustered together. And we see that other major powers have no incentive to help them, which gets on to why should colonial powers specifically help. As my partner brings up, there are many examples where colonial powers has caused many harms to their colonies. And we see that they are first and foremost the people who should help them. We see that other major powers will think, like, let's say England did something really bad to a colony. They'll say, why shouldn't England help them first? Like, they benefited from harming them, so now they should help them first, and they just sit idly by. But then once England helps them, they may see, okay, now I can help them because that's fair. So what have I done for you today? I provided analysis on why colonial powers should specifically help their colonies and why helping results in a better world. So proud to oppose.
You're here. All right, so I'd like to give one final congratulations to all the teams in the final for an excellent round.